Hello and you're welcome to the Big Tech Show with me, Adrian. Now, are you thinking of buying an electric car in 2025? There's mostly good news on the way with cheaper models and more second-hand stock available, but you will also need to know some basics about owning an electric car, which rarely, I have to say, get covered anywhere else. We're going to go over those, but first we're going to remind ourselves of what exactly has gone wrong with the electric car market in Ireland, particularly with sales, and why Clarke, who is a producer of this podcast and is here to talk to me today about this. The figures at the start of January paint a very, very stark picture. Petrol and diesel car sales were up healthily last year compared to 2023, but electric car sales were down, and not just a bit, but by 24%, 17,000 out of the 121,000 cars registered here as new last year were electric. That is a total slump on the 2023 figure. And there was some small sign of a pickup in the last 2 months of the year, but overall, the picture has been of a collapse in confidence in electric cars in Ireland, as well as in some other countries around Europe. And we're going to talk just for a minute or two about why that is.
Right. And I suppose, 14.4% of the overall registered cars in 2024 are EVs. Why do you think that is?
There are three reasons, I think, in particular. The first one is an obvious one: pricing and lack of affordable models. So on average, despite the price cuts that happened with electric cars, they're still slightly more or considerably more expensive than their petrol or diesel equivalents. Now, not the same gap as there was 2 or 3 years ago, but they're still more expensive. And bear in mind that an awful lot of electric cars are new. So you're paying the new price, and there's a big second-hand car market in Ireland. The second reason is a lack of confidence in them holding their value. So if you bought one, like me, I bought one. I bought a Volkswagen ID3, which I am very pleased with as a car in general. There are some provisos and riders to that, which we will go into, which apply to all electric cars. But overall, I'm very pleased for it. But I paid 42,000 euro for that car. And 18 months later, it was worth maybe 25. So there was a huge depreciation, a huge fall off in value. And for somebody, there are a lot of stories like that. People lost even more on, when they bought a new electric car. So those stories went around and they were true. And that has hit confidence in buying electric cars. Now, the price of most electric cars actually fell. The manufacturers reduced the prices across the board by 7, 8, 9, 10,000 euro. So it's very unlikely that would happen again. But that's a reason why sales were bad last year. And the third reason is infrastructure. And you see this in the figures that were released by the Society of the Irish Motor Industry. You see where sales were down the most in Ireland were in rural counties, Donegal, Kerry, Mayo, anywhere that's not beside a city, because the charging infrastructure is so bad outside Irish cities. Now, I know that there are EV car owners, and they're part of online clubs and Reddit boards and all that sort of stuff. And they will say that's overstating the fact that there are some chargers, and there are some fast chargers being built around the place. I know this because I use some of these fast chargers. I can tell you, as somebody who's owned an electric car for 2 years and who does travel to rural locations from my home base in Dublin, that the charging infrastructure is still quite poor.
Right. And I think as well, just because I think you come in for a lot of criticism over this, you principally bought an electric car because you believe in, going electric. And that's the reason.
For environmental reasons.
Yes,
because
exactly.
Overall, it is a better solution for the environment. I knew it was going to be expensive. I knew that there was going to be poor charging infrastructure. So I knew all of this. I didn't realize quite how bad the public charging infrastructure was and continues to be. And that's my view of it as somebody who owns a car and who has to rely on it sometimes. If somebody else has a different view, then by all means go and listen to them and make your mind up between the two. But they're the reasons, in my opinion, 3 specific reasons why sales were so bad. Now, there is reason for optimism. This is not a doom and gloom episode about electric cars necessarily, because this year, 2025, there are going to be a lot more cheaper electric cars on the market. There are 5 in particular that are going to be sold for under 25,000 euros. It's the equivalent of your, your Ford Fiesta or your small petrol car. You have the Hyundai Enster, you've got the Dacia Spring, which should come in at around 20,000 euro. You've the Renault 5, Fiat Grande Panda, and the Citroen EC3. Now, they are models which, that's the kind of car at a price point which we've never seen in Ireland before, and that will absolutely spur sales. I have no doubt whatsoever that the sales in 2025 will be higher than sales in 2024, and that is the main reason, despite the poor infrastructure, despite the government not giving a damn about electric cars. Because let's call a spade here. There's been a massive public policy failure in Ireland over electric cars.
Yeah.
There was a lot of grand sounding statements, and then they just walked away from it. There was no mass rollout of public infrastructure. There is a very slow rollout of public infrastructure. They cut the subsidies on electric cars. When I bought it was 5,000 euro towards the price of a new car. They cut it to 3,500 euro. I mean, this is a country that's rolling in money. There was no reason to cut that subsidy other than they don't really care about sales. So, however, sales this year will be better because there's going to be more cheaper models. The other thing spurring that on is there are going to be fines on the car manufacturers who don't have a lot of electric cars. And let me explain that for a second. From 2025, from this year until 2029, the average new car in Europe should emit no more than 94 grams of carbon dioxide for each kilometre. Okay? Now, we're doing this because the EU has a policy of phasing out petrol and diesel by 2035. And for car makers that fail to meet those targets, and these are measured by fleet averages, so all of the cars, take Volkswagen, Europe's biggest car maker, all of the car models that it sells, everything from a Polo up to an ID4, everything, they face a fine of 95 euro for every gram of carbon dioxide above the target. Now, what that means in practice is that Volkswagen could be facing a bill, they will be facing a bill of several billion euro this year in fines because they're only selling a certain amount of ID3s, ID4s, ID5s, ID7s, ID2s, the electric range fleet versus, Golf, Polo.
Because it ceases to become financially viable now to sell.
Well, it just means if you know you're going to be facing those fines, you're naturally going to put more energy into rejuvenating your fleet. You might even reduce the prices a bit more. You might, increase production. So it won't change the balance overnight, but it should help. So I have no doubt in my mind that electric car sales will be higher in 2025. You'll get better deals. Showrooms will be more aggressively incentivized to sell them. Up till now, you walk into a showroom and half the salesmen there are talking down electric cars. I had to sell my late mother's Toyota Yaris about 10 months ago. And the salesman I was talking to was just did nothing but talk down electric cars, even though Toyota sells them. I mean, it was I couldn't understand. They're not especially motivated to sell electric cars, in my experience.
Right. And I suppose because it's optimism that we're going for here. And if you are of the mind, if a listener here is of the mind to get an EV, what are the sort of, you used to go to your uncle and you'd say, like, what do I need to watch out for when I go to the garage, tire kicking, etc. What are the things we need to watch out for, when we're on the lot for EVs?
So there's a couple of things. First of all, it depends whether you're buying new or secondhand. Let's talk about new cars for the moment because they're the easiest to quantify in terms of the unknowable. So battery range to me is a very big thing. It's a very big deal, battery range. And the electric car that you buy, generally speaking, the bigger the battery, the more expensive it is. And they're heavier and they're more expensive to produce, but they get you further. So the battery in the car that I have, for example, is a 58 kilowatt battery in the Volkswagen ID3. Now that has an advertised range of around 430 kilometers. That's not a correct range in anything but warm temperatures at relatively slow speeds. In most circumstances in Ireland, if you were traveling on a primary road at up to 100 kilometers per hour, and if you're doing it at say at 8 degrees or 9 degrees Celsius outside, which is just a bit below the average temperature in Ireland all year round, you will get something of the order of about maybe 340 kilometers, 350 kilometers for a fully charged battery. Now, that's not too bad. If you do it in January, in the cold snap we're having it at the moment, where it's maybe 6 degrees outside, that will reduce again to closer to 300 kilometers. If you go onto a motorway and you travel at 120 kilometers per hour, say Dublin to Cork, and let's say there's a southwesterly wind against you and it's 6 degrees outside and you have the heater on in the car because you deserve to have heat in your car, correct? As a normal human being in the 21st century, then you might only get about 260 kilometers, 250 kilometers. So that at that point now, you're starting to hover around the actual distance from Dublin to Cork. So I've done this several times. So in the summertime, not a problem to go from Dublin to Cork on a full charge on an electric car with a range of 425 kilometers advertised, even though it's only 260 kilometers. The wintertime, you often can't make it.
Right.
You're going to have to stop to get a charge.
And I'm interested as well. So as the buyer then, are you considering whether you are using it as gen purpose? Do you make a lot of, trips, across the country, or are you just buying it as a city car?
Well, you see, I think this is my own view now, because it's hard to get into the mind of everybody. But I think when you buy a car, I think most people buy it with a certain use case in mind, but they like to also have the option of using it for something else. So, for example, most Irish people live close to a big city or a big town. And if you are only going to be doing your shopping locally, and the most of the trips that you make, any electric car on the market, even one with a really short range, should do the trick just fine. The issue is that many of us have friends or relatives who live down the country, or we want to go somewhere else in the country. And that is the idea of having a car. It's not just this idea of getting, the civic planner's view of somebody buying a car. To get the 11 kilometers average. That's not entirely what having a car is. If you want to maybe go to Donegal, or you want to go on a holiday to Kerry or something like that, a lot of people will want to rely on their car from that, even if they don't do it during the year. That's certainly my mentality. I don't want to have a vehicle that only goes to the city limits or to the county limits or even to the province limits. I mean, like many small battery electric cars, even though I wouldn't buy one because they wouldn't go far enough for me, but it will absolutely get you to, Wexford and back from Dublin. It'll get you to Drogheda and back, those kind of distances. That is absolutely fine for the majority of your trips. And it's a very good reason to buy a second-hand electric car. You'll get a really good deal on something like a Nissan Leaf. And I'm talking like, 12,000 euro, that kind of price, 10,000 euro. And it's a really nice car to drive. You'll get a great experience out of it, even though your range might only be, 90 kilometers. I mean, it may only be about 90 kilometers.
Yeah.
Especially in the wintertime. And
if you're looking at, say, for example, the Nissan Leaf that you just mentioned secondhand, and you're then plotting a trip cross country, visit relatives, or, up to Bundoran for the weekend, do you then have to start, planning in where is the fast charging point, where is the slow charging point? What's the difference, first of all?
Yeah, this is the next point, which is public charging infrastructure. Now, I've already laid into that and said it's absolutely crap. And generally speaking, it's poor. But there are some things you need to know. Yes, you will need to plan beforehand. So if you are going, you mentioned Bundoran, for example. So you'll be going on probably the N4 from Dublin. If you're going from Dublin, you might come from Limerick. You might be coming from the north. You might come from somewhere else. Generally speaking, the further you are away from sort of large towns, the worse the public infrastructure is. So you need to go on one of the apps. There's a lot of apps you can get. The SB has one. There's one called ZapMap. They're fairly good. It's not great that there are 3 or 4 competing ones and that some of them rely on users themselves to tell you whether one is working or not. That's actually not great. I know the enthusiasts love it. They think they're part of a community. That's fine. For the rest of us ordinary people who literally just want to get from A to B, it's not great. It's not ideal. But they do work.
a lot of the time. You will have to go on one of those apps or go on a map and then find out where the nearest charger is. You will then also have to be mentally prepared. If that is the only fast charger on your route, you will have to be prepared to wait to get onto it. Now, a lot of the time you won't. A lot of the time you'll just drive up into it and you'll start charging, and you'll get, depending on what your car is and depending on how fast the charger is, you could get, half a charge in your entire car in 25 minutes. You could absolutely get that, but you may have to wait to get onto that charger. I've been in a situation many times where I've got to wait, normally no more than about 15 minutes, in fairness, normally 15-20 minutes. It's worse in small towns. In small towns you might have, say, one or two chargers there, and they're slow chargers or medium paced chargers, and someone will park there and go off and have their dinner for 2 hours and then come back. So you cannot rely on charging infrastructure in small towns. The other thing I've noticed is more than once, and frequently enough for me to mention it in this podcast episode, chargers break, or they don't work, or there's some issue with them. And the faster the charger is, and the more of a main arterial route or motorway that it's beside or located around, the quicker that problem will be addressed. But the smaller the town, the less motivated they will be to fix it. I've had more than one incident in Belmullet and County Mayo and one other town as well, down in Cork, where a charger has not been working, and I've rung up and they said, no, we're sorry, we won't be able to get an engineer out there for 2 days. Great, lads. So what do? I have to go now. I have to go back to my relative's house maybe and say, do you mind if I plug the car into your 3-pin ordinary wall and wait 3 hours or 4 hours till I can get, say, 15 or 20% to get me to Ballina where there's a fast charger? Now, in reality, that's a sort of a desperate situation, and you wouldn't leave yourself in that situation. Through driving an electric car now for 2 years, I know I'm never going to be in a position where I only have, say, 5% of a charge left and I'm utterly dependent on a charger in a small town. That would never happen. But my point is, you have to be aware of this. You cannot treat public charging infrastructure the way you treat a filling station, a petrol station. You'll find a petrol station every 5 or 10 kilometers all around the country. You fill it up in 60 seconds. There's never a wait, or almost never a wait to get on. There's no issue with range. There's no issue with availability. There's a major issue with the lack of public charging points for somebody who goes around the country. Again, I'm talking about a situation where you are driving somewhere, exceptionally, maybe around Christmas time, maybe, for holidays. But if you were, say, a sales rep for a company and you were driving around, the country to different places, you really, really would not want to be depending at the moment on the public charging infrastructure around the country. It would seriously at some point disrupt your work schedule.
Right. And just as you say at the moment, because I remember you saying that, once commercial fleets start, incorporating EVs, as you mentioned with the traveling sales rep, when do you think it won't be a requisite to have an encyclopedic knowledge of where all the fast chargers are? Is that an impossible question?
At the moment, you cannot just get into an electric car and just start driving, knowing that you will need a public charge, but trusting in the system to have one. It just doesn't work. It's not like driving a petrol or a diesel car. It takes more intentionality. You have to plan stuff more. All of the things that I've been mentioning. Now, on the other hand, let me flip it for a second to talk about the benefits of charging. And here's a very, very major benefit, massive. And that is, if you charge at home via a wall charger, which costs around 900,000 euro when you take the subsidy into account, it costs about a quarter or third of the price of petrol or diesel. It's really cheap.
So just for the benefit of me and the listeners, a full charge in your ID3, how much do you
So
reckon?
a full charge in my ID, let's say I get 350 kilometers out of that. That will cost me per kilometer. That will cost me, say if I had a Golf, which is roughly the same size, it might cost about maybe 80 euro to fill that full of diesel, that Golf.
Yeah.
it will cost me something in the region of €20 to charge up the ID. Now, sorry, but to be clear here, the Golf, a Golf full of petrol or diesel will go at least twice as far as my fully charged ID3. But even that, taking that into consideration, it's still less than half the cost to charge per kilometre.
Right.
If you see what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So it's maybe €20 to charge my ID3 at home versus say 80, €85 for the petrol. I go only half the distance in my ID3 per charge, but because it's a quarter of the price, it's still less than half the price.
Yeah, that makes sense. And
That is a huge benefit to charging and to home charging as well. And it means that you never have to go near a forecourt really for public charging if you can avoid the public charging network. And that means you're not buying a muffin or a coffee, and you're not actually spending the extra €4, €5, €6 or all the crap.
Passing trade, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the benefit to low-cost charging does not apply when you're charging publicly at a fast charger in the public infrastructure network. It's about the same price as petrol or diesel.
Yeah. But it's also prohibitive in maybe some respects, the home charging, and it's available to people with a driveway.
This is a huge thing as well, and it's if you live in an apartment complex, even if your management committee has talked about ambitious plans of having charging spots down in the car park, that's fine, unless they're talking about 15 or 20 charging spots, for say 100 apartments or 200, 150 apartments. I would be very anxious about relying on that, because if you're talking about 3 or 4 spots, you're going to find that there are people who leave their cars there for hours and hours and hours, like overnight. You might need to get somewhere the next day. You can't get a charge. You end up then having to go out to the public charging infrastructure somewhere else. Honestly, it's not a great solution for somebody who owns an apartment. Now, it can be if you are the type of person who only puts maybe 4,000 or 5,000 kilometers on your car a year, and it really is only a runaround, then absolutely, it's fine. No problem. In an apartment, you'll only be charging it, once every maybe 10 days or something. That's absolutely fine. But for the rest of us, for people who use their car the way that they might use a petrol or diesel car, which is the majority of the country, I would say, it's a big challenge to own one in an apartment. And there are some around Dublin anyway who are in terraced houses, which again, a lot of them don't have driveways, red brick terraces or other type of terraced houses. And they've tried to come up with solutions where the innovative way of charging, where they have a kind of a pole at the front of their yard or beside their path, and there's an overhanging cable that connects their car. Dublin City Council has said that they're not allowed. You can't do it.
Yeah. I mean, like as in knowing the sort of insurance scape the way I do, like that kind of trip hazard or overhang hazard is where they're coming from, but it's prohibitive because people in terraced houses, you're locking people out of the EV market, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. So charging is a big issue. If you have a driveway, you're golden. You're not going to have any problem with charging privately anyway. So there are 6 things that I think you should know. One that we've covered. 1, cold weather. When the temperature drops, your range drops. That's maybe not that dissimilar, by the way, for petrol cars, and certainly for point number 2, which is motorways and national roads and speed. When you hit higher speeds, your range drops as well. But it is for electric cars. So cold weather, motorways and national roads. Public charging is definitely an issue, not an unsurmountable one, but it's a significant challenge. Home charging is the way to go, and you'll save a lot of money, so that's really good. Pricing and depreciation. I mentioned all of the cheaper cars that are coming on the market. That is very, very good. I would also say, I will repeat, that the cliff that depreciation experienced 18 months ago is very unlikely to happen again. So if you buy an electric car now, either secondhand or new, it's highly unlikely that you're going to see the kind of 40% depreciation in 18 months that you did around the time I bought, because manufacturers have reduced their prices. That's probably a one-time massive correction, to use the jargon, of the market. So I don't think that's as big an issue. If that is the reason, that if that's holding you back from considering an electric car, I don't think it should be. I think that's been done. I mean, I suffered from it, but I still don't regret it, by the way. Despite all of the challenges I'm talking about, I actually really like driving my electric car, and I will stay electric. I will buy electric
Going
again.
forward.
Yeah. So yeah, pricing depreciation. And then buying secondhand, the only piece of advice I would have here is to check the battery level, the battery health level.
Battery check.
Now, it can vary a lot from car to car here, but overall, a normal electric car, if you say drive 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 kilometers a year, you could be looking at a degradation of the battery, anything from about, if you're lucky, it might only be like 2% or something a year, right? But it could be as high as 5, 6, 7%. It could be, depending on the kind of mileage you do. And so if you're, say, looking at a 3-year-old electric car to buy, you should ask what the battery percentage is. And it really, you would be hoping that it's 90% plus.
Right. So
that's what you're hoping for.
And if it's below 90%, 85%, that's your red line. Stay away from it.
Well, not if it was a 5-year-old car. No, if it was a 2 or 3-year-old car, if it was a 3-year-old car with 85% battery, that would be a warning sign for me, because unless the mileage is really high, unless they have like 80,000 kilometers on it or something, in which case I could understand why the battery was lower. And just to take a step back and explain, I know that listeners to this podcast will understand that when you charge anything or recharge anything with a battery, from a laptop to a phone to an electric car, a tiny bit of the battery's efficacy fades. That's with every single charge. That's why phones will come with, it'll say, oh, you can recharge it, 700 times or 800 times or something like that. It will have that level. It will come with that advice, and beyond which it has a much, much lower battery life. It's the exact same for electric cars. And anyone, by the way, who tries to tell you that their electric car is at 100% after 2 or 3 years and they've put 40,000 kilometers, that's not actually possible. It's not actually physically possible. Right. So just for people to understand that. So they're the main things I think people should understand and be prepared for. Sorry, the last thing was the idea of batteries just not working after a certain amount of time. So batteries will degrade after a number of time. But most manufacturers guarantee, 6, 7, 8 years on the battery to not go below maybe 75%. That's a standard guarantee that a manufacturer will give you when the car is bought new. There is some, you will sometimes hear or read about concerns over a battery just not working after, say, 8 years, and just that's it can't be. To the best of my knowledge, that's mostly unfounded.
Right.
As far as I can see.
Yeah, and I mean, I think especially with the sort of regulations and strictures around automobiles and EVs, there's no planned obsolescence. Like with a phone, it's not going to last you longer than a certain amount of time.
Well, yeah, I don't fully agree with that. I don't necessarily buy into the sort of the semi-conspiracy theory of planned obsolescence.
Well, they're not built to last forever. Like, I mean,
no, but
there's
production. There's nothing's built to last. I mean, can you think of anything that's built to last forever?
No, but when I say forever, I mean it in a sort of general sense. Like,
I used to have this argument with Matt Cooper sometimes. He sort of when mobile phones first became a thing, and smartphones first became a thing, he couldn't understand why they didn't last, say, as long as fridges.
Okay, well, that's not my point.
10 years, 12 years. Like, why can't you buy a smartphone that can reliably last you and do everything you want to do for 10 years?
Yeah, I mean,
on one level you can see where he was coming with that. On another level, you're thinking it's a different type of product, it's a different type of thing. Just because it might only last, say, 4.5 or 5 years, which most smartphones will last, that length. Doesn't equate to saying there's planned obsolescence, that the engineers get together and they say, well, look, here's the thing. look, Dave, I'm afraid we're going to have to revise those engineering plans because this looks too well made. It might last into the sixth year. I don't believe that those conversations happen.
I mean, that's a fair point, and it's the first time I've heard it. I think the production line method of producing stuff means less individual care, and that's that's the reason.
Yeah, probably, but that's the difference.
Out of.
Maybe the difference between buying, say, a Canon camera and a Leica camera. Leica cameras are handmade, a lot of them. So you'll pay $4,500-5,000 for one. You'll pay $1,200 for a Canon. So all of these things, there are trade-offs for sure. You will get less. Maybe an individually made thing would maybe last longer. You could argue that, but in terms of electric cars, I don't think that the argument has ever been that there's planned obsolescence with electric cars. I think the argument has been that it's not known what happens to the batteries after, say, 8 or 9 years because so few people have electric cars that are that old, and therefore we don't have a collective industrial
experience or memory of it. Yeah. I think that's probably correct, and I think as well that it's a new thing. It's like an iPhone. How long should there's no 50-year-old iPhones out there.
And look, the point of doing this episode of the podcast is to acknowledge that the vast majority, not just the majority, the vast majority of people in Ireland and abroad as well have never driven an electric car. They don't own an electric car and they've never driven an electric car. For the vast majority of people, this is still a new thing that they would be jumping into. And when you jump into something, you want to know what the potential challenges and pitfalls are, as well as the upsides. Okay, you want to know that. And this is the reason we're doing this episode, is to let people know that an electric car, in my opinion, is a superior driving experience. It is much better for the environment, in my opinion. And there are many, many upsides, but there are also downsides. And there is no point jumping into it if you find that it does not suit your driving purposes. That's the only reason we mention these.
Yeah, and to
things.
as in you can hear the sort of stuff that's problematic about them, and that'll maybe mitigate your experience if you're able to sort of eat around the bad bits of the apple.
I'm a good example because I've experienced all of these negative things that we're talking about, and yet if you ask me the question, do I regret buying my Volkswagen ID3 with the depreciation I've had, with the poor public infrastructure? No, I do not. I love driving it. I would buy it again.
Yeah.
I might buy again. I mean, I might update maybe, don't know about 2025, maybe 2026. And I can't see myself going to a diesel petrol. I mean, maybe I'd consider a hybrid, but I don't think so, because the issue with a hybrids are a great compromise for a lot of people, for people who are in cities and who rarely go outside cities, because you're going to charge it, a plug-in hybrid, you'll get 50, 60, 70 kilometers out of the small battery in your hybrid, and the rest is petrol. But that 50, 60, 70 kilometers is enough to get you around the city, to get you for 80, 90% of your ordinary driving capabilities. And then you need, when you need petrol, if you want to go down the country, you can do so absolutely fine. Just fill up the same as you would normally. The issue I have with hybrids is that if I am using the car a certain percentage of my annual kilometers driving to rural areas, which I do, then the battery in the hybrid isn't that useful to me because it's only getting me the first 60 kilometers. And then I'm lugging around a fairly heavy battery, which puts more strain on the weight of the car, which means I use up more petrol. So I don't see how that massively benefits me. If I'm just doing 99% urban trips, then a hybrid makes fantastic value. You're basically driving an electric car with the peace of mind that if you need to go down to go further, you've got petrol. It's a superb solution for those cases, and it also drives really nicely because when you're driving on battery, especially, it's lovely and silent. You get the extra kick in terms of torque, fast acceleration. We haven't even talked about the performance benefits of an electric car or the maintenance costs. Like I bought mine in January 2023. It's now only due its first service this month, 2 years later.
Yeah.
2 years.
That just doesn't happen.
No service fees,
with
no
petrol
service
or
costs, cheap charging. in many ways, it's the most hassle-free car you can buy. If you don't like the sort of the whole language and ecosystem of, mechanics and knowing this, that, some people do, but if you don't, if you just want hassle-free driving, electric is fantastic.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I suppose your I suppose recommendation that like if you were to buy again, you're going to go EV is
100%.
probably, yeah,
100%. So that is the ultimate proof, I think. Now, that is me. We're all different. I do know people who bought electric, it didn't suit them, and they have gone back to diesel or they have gone hybrid. That's totally fine. For me, given everything, the environmental benefits, the driving benefits, the less hassle in terms of mechanics, and also I do have a driveway, I'm sticking with electric. So look, guys, I hope you have a slightly better understanding of what's at stake in owning and running an electric car, what the upsides and the downsides are, and what the prospects are for 2025, which are definitely better than 2024 because they couldn't really be much worse, I'll be honest with you. JJ Clarke, who joined me on this episode, also produces the podcast, and Gav Hennessy was on sound. From me, Adrian Weckler, I'll see you soon.